A fork clattered off a table and bounced across the diner floor. A woman flinched. A man across from her leaned back and laughed loud so the whole room could hear him. He said something about her size, something cruel, and pointed at her plate. She looked down at her lap. Her fork stayed where it fell. Nobody moved to pick it up. Rain hammered the windows. A German shepherd waited in a truck outside, watching the door. And near that door stood a big man in a leather vest, soaked to the shoulders, who had just heard every word. His name was Duke Calloway, and Marlene Ashby had worked beside him for 3 long years. He did not roll up his sleeves. He did not raise his voice. He pulled out a chair. What Duke said next left that whole diner in tears. "Stay with me on this one. Let me back this up a little, because if I just drop you into that moment, you won't feel the weight of it. You'll see a big biker and a scared woman and a loudmouth at a table. That's not the story. The story is 3 years long, so let me tell it right. Duke Calloway ran a shop out on the edge of Barstow, right where the town gives up and the desert takes over. Calloway Custom, the sign said, though half the letters had faded in the sun. He built motorcycles, not the kind you buy off a floor. The kind men saved for years to own, the kind you handed Duke a photo of and said, "Make me this." And he did. His hands were scarred and burned and steady, and he could take a pile of rusted steel and turn it into something that made grown men go quiet. People drove 300 miles to have him build them a bike. Some of them cried when they saw the finished thing. He never knew what to do when they cried, so he'd nod and wipe his hands on a rag and tell them to ride safe. He was also president of a small riding club. Nothing wild. Mostly older men, veterans, a couple of retired truckers, men who'd been through things and didn't need to talk about them. They met Sunday mornings, drank coffee, argued about engines, and rode out into the desert where the road went straight for 40 miles and nobody bothered anybody. When Duke walked into a room, people straightened up. He was built big, military big, thick through the neck and shoulders, gray coming into his beard. He didn't smile much. He didn't waste words. And most people who met him assumed he was a hard man all the way through. Most people were wrong. Because here's the thing about Duke. For all that size, for all that leather, the toughest thing that man ever faced was a woman named Marlene Ashby, and the fear she put in him had nothing to do with fists. Marlene came to work at the shop 3 years before that rainy night. She answered an ad Duke had stuck in the window because his books were a disaster, and his phone rang off the hook and he couldn't do both. She walked in wearing a cardigan and carrying a folder of references nobody had asked for, and she was heavyset, and she was nervous, and she knocked over a cup of pens on his desk within the first 2 minutes. She apologized about 6 times. She got down on her knees to pick them up, knocked over a stack of invoices doing it, and apologized again, and Duke watched this whole small disaster unfold and felt something in his chest he hadn't felt in years. Duke hired her before she finished picking them up. I'll be honest with you. He couldn't have told you why, not back then. He just knew the shop felt different with her in it. Warmer. Like it had been missing something and now it wasn't. The place had been a cave before her, all grease and metal and silence. She brought a little radio from home and played the old country stations low, and after 2 weeks Duke couldn't work without it. Within a month, she'd sorted 3 years of receipts. Within 2, she knew every customer by name and remembered which ones were waiting on parts and which ones were just lonely and liked to call. She made coffee strong enough to strip paint, exactly the way Duke liked it, and left it on his bench without a word every morning at 7. When Duke's temper got short with a supplier on the phone, she'd catch his eye and shake her head just slightly, and he'd take a breath and start over. She managed him. Nobody else on this earth could do that. She did more than run the books. She'd remember that old Pete Hanley's wife was sick and tuck a card in with his invoice. She'd notice when a customer's check was late and quietly cover it out of petty cash and never mention it, because she knew the man was proud and out of work. She kept a jar of hard candy on the counter for the kids who came in with their fathers. The whole town moved a little softer around Calloway Custom once Marlene was in it, and hardly anybody stopped to wonder why. And somewhere in that first year, without noticing when it happened, Duke Calloway fell in love with her. He never said it. Not once, not in 3 years. You have to understand what kind of man he was. He'd stared down men twice his meanness. He'd ridden through storms that peeled the paint off his tank. But the idea of telling Marlene how he felt and seeing pity on her face, or worse, seeing her decide the shop wasn't safe anymore and leave, that terrified him. So he did what men like Duke do. He said nothing, and he showed everything, and he hoped she'd figure it out. He fixed the heater at her desk before winter without being asked. He learned she took her tea with too much sugar and started keeping her brand in the cabinet. When her old sedan finally died, he rebuilt the engine over a weekend and told her he just had spare parts lying around. That was a lie. He bought every one of those parts, drove to 3 towns to find them, and stayed up till 2 in the morning so it'd be ready before she needed it. When she caught a cold, he showed up at her door with soup from the diner and stood there red-faced, holding it out like it might bite him, and said, "Eat," and drove off before she could ask him in. He remembered her birthday and pretended he didn't, then left a wrapped scarf on her chair and disappeared into the back for an hour so he wouldn't have to watch her open it. She never once caught him at any of it, or if she did, she was too kind to say. She thanked him. She smiled that smile that made his chest go tight, and she never once guessed. 3 years and the bravest man in Barstow couldn't manage 6 words to the woman he loved. Then came the Friday. Marlene was different that morning, lighter on her feet. She hummed while she filed and there was color in her face. And around lunchtime she told Duke, almost shy about it, that she had a date that night. A man she'd met at the church supper. He'd asked her to dinner at the diner on Main. Duke was under a bike when she said it. He'd been tightening a bolt and his hand went still on the wrench. He looked at the concrete floor and he didn't let her see his face. "Good for you," he said. His voice came out flat. "That's real good, Marlene." She said she was nervous. She hadn't been on a date in more years than she cared to count, and she didn't know what to wear, and she'd probably say something foolish and scare him off. Duke, still under the bike, told her to wear the blue dress, the one she'd worn to the shop's holiday party. He told her she looked nice in it. There was a little silence. Then she said, real soft, "You noticed that dress?" Duke closed his eyes under the bike. "Course I did," he said. Then he changed the subject fast before his voice gave him away. He asked her about a parts order that had already come in. She answered him gentle, like she knew something was under the question and was letting him have his cover. That night he closed the shop, fed Bandit, his German shepherd, and told himself he was happy for her. He told himself that about 40 times. He sat at his kitchen table with a cold plate in front of him and the dog's chin on his knee, and he said the words out loud to the empty room. "I'm happy for her." And somewhere around the 40th time, he realized he couldn't sit in that house another minute. So he grabbed his keys, loaded the dog into the truck, and drove into town for no reason he'd admit out loud. He wasn't going to the diner, that's what he told himself. He just wanted a burger. There were 3 places in Barstow. He picked the one on Main. You already know that was a lie too. The rain started hard as he drove. By the time he pulled into the lot, it was coming down in sheets. Bandit whined and pressed against the window. Duke told him to stay, promised he'd be quick, and jogged across the lot with his collar up. He shouldered through the door, wiped the water from his eyes, and looked up. And there she was, Marlene in the blue dress at a booth by the window, glowing. Laughing at something, one hand pressed to her chest the way she did when she was truly happy. Across from her sat a man in a pressed shirt, hair combed back, a smug set to his mouth. And for 1 second Duke's whole chest ached because she looked so beautiful and so hopeful, and he was too late, and it was his own fault for waiting 3 years. He almost turned around and walked back out into the rain. He should have. It would have hurt less. He told himself to go, told himself he had no right, that this was her night and her chance, and the last thing she needed was him lurking by the door like a storm cloud. But he didn't go, and that one choice, to stay standing by that door for 30 more seconds, changed everything. Because 30 seconds was long enough to hear the man start to talk. Duke stood just inside the door, dripping, half hidden by a coat rack, and he wasn't trying to listen. But the man's voice carried. That kind of man always makes sure it does. Marlene had gotten up to use the restroom, and the second she was out of earshot, the whole shape of the man changed. The charm dropped off his face like a mask coming loose. The waitress came by to refill his coffee, young thing, couldn't have been 20. And the man leaned toward her with a grin and jerked his thumb at the empty seat where Marlene had been. "You believe that," he said, low and amused. "Big girl like that thinking somebody drove all the way out here for her company." He laughed. "I'm here for the free meal, sweetheart. She offered to pay. Figured I'd let her. Get a steak out of it, watch her eat, have a story for the boys." The waitress didn't laugh. She stood there with the coffee pot, her smile freezing over, and the man kept going because men like that never know when to stop. "When she gets back, watch this," he said. "I'll tell her the portions here are big like her. See if she gets it." He said his buddies had a bet going whether he'd even last the whole dinner. Said he ought to get hazard pay. He chuckled at his own joke. Real proud of himself. The waitress set the pot down on the next table and walked away from him without a word, and he didn't even notice she'd gone. Now let me tell you what was happening on the other side of that room. Duke Calloway hadn't moved, not 1 inch. But something behind his eyes had gone very still and very cold, the way the desert goes still right before a storm breaks. His hands, those big scarred hands, had curled slowly into fists at his sides. 3 years of everything he'd never said was rising up in him all at once. He could have crossed that floor in 4 steps and put that man through the window. Part of him wanted to. Every muscle he had wanted to. And the whole diner would have understood. But that wasn't what Marlene needed. Duke knew it even then. A busted-up date would be a story that man told for years, twisting it, making himself the victim, dragging her name through it. Poor guy tried to be nice to a lonely woman and her biker friend went crazy on him. No, what that man deserved wasn't a broken jaw. It was the truth, said out loud in front of every person in that room with nowhere to hide from it. So Duke breathed. He unclenched his hands. And when Marlene came back from the restroom, smiling, sliding into her seat, hopeful all over again, he waited. He let her get comfortable. He watched the man turn the charm back on like a light switch, watched him lean in and say something that made her laugh, and it made Duke sick, how easy the lie came to him. Watched him reach across and touch her hand, and watched her look down at that hand like it was the finest thing that had happened to her in a year. The man raised a hand and called the waitress back for the check. Casual, relaxed. He'd already won in his mind. Free steak, a good story, a woman too grateful to see through him. He stretched an arm along the back of the booth and smiled at Marlene, and she smiled back, and the whole thing looked from a distance like the start of something sweet. The rain eased off outside to a steady patter. The diner settled into that warm, low hum of a Friday night. Somebody put a coin in the jukebox. Marlene looked happier than Duke had seen her in a long time. And for just a moment, standing there by the door, Duke thought maybe he'd leave it alone. Maybe he'd let her have this night and deal with the man some other way, some other time. He took a step back toward the door. His hand found the handle. It was over. He'd let it go. Then the man opened his mouth one more time. "You know," the man said, loud now, loud enough for the tables around them to hear, tilting his head at Marlene's plate. "You sure you want dessert on top of all that?" He grinned. "Diners got big portions, real big, figured that'd be your kind of place." And he laughed, alone, waiting for her to laugh with him. Marlene didn't laugh. Her smile came apart slow, like something cracking. She set down her fork and it slipped from her fingers and clattered off the table and bounced across the floor. She didn't reach for it. Her hand went to her lap, and her eyes dropped to the table and her shoulders folded in on themselves, the way a person does when they've heard a thing like that too many times in their life and stopped being surprised by it. Just wounded. Quietly, terribly wounded. That was it. That was the moment. Duke let go of the door handle. He didn't storm across the room. He didn't shout. He walked, slow and even, boots wet on the linoleum, and the whole diner felt him coming before they saw him. Big man, leather vest, water still running off his shoulders, face like the side of a mountain. Conversations died at the tables he passed. The waitress went still with the coffee pot in her hand. A trucker at the counter set down his cup to watch. He stopped at their booth. Before I tell you what he said, do me one favor. If you've ever had somebody stand up for you when you couldn't stand up for yourself, or wish to God somebody would, hit that subscribe button and stay with me, because this is the part I really want you to hear. The man looked up at Duke, annoyed, then a flicker of unease crossing his face when he took in the size of him. "Help you, pal," he said, going for tough and missing it by a mile. Duke didn't answer him. He didn't even look at him. He reached down, picked up a chair from the empty table beside them, turned it around and sat, calm as Sunday morning, right at the end of their booth. Then he looked at her. Only at her. "Evening, Marlene," he said, gentle as anything. "That blue dress. I was right. You look real nice tonight." Marlene's head came up. Her eyes were wet and confused and full of 100 questions. "Duke," she whispered. "What are you doing here?" "I came for a burger," he said. And then he did look at the man. Slow. "And I heard some things I wasn't supposed to hear." The man's face went a shade paler. He forced a laugh. "Look, buddy, this is a private." "You showed up for a free steak," Duke said, voice flat and quiet and carrying to every corner of the room. "You told that girl there," and he nodded at the waitress, "that you drove out here to watch her eat and get a story for your friends. You called her a big girl. You said your buddies had a bet on whether you'd last the meal. You laughed about it while she was in the bathroom fixing her hair for you." The whole diner had gone silent now. Forks down. Nobody chewing. Even the jukebox seemed to hush. Marlene turned to the man. The hope drained out of her face and left something worse behind. "Is that true?" she said. Her voice barely made it out. "Is that true?" The man's mouth opened and shut. He looked at Duke, then at the room full of eyes, then back at Marlene, scrambling. "That's not," he stammered, "he's twisting it, I never." "You did," said the waitress. Everybody turned. The girl stood there, coffee pot trembling in her hand, tears already coming. "You did," she said again, louder. "You said it right to me. I was standing right here." And she looked at Marlene and her voice broke. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. I should have said something the second he opened his mouth. I'm so sorry." And that's when Duke Calloway leaned forward, put his big scarred forearms on that table, and said the thing he'd been holding in for 3 years. "I want to tell you about this woman," Duke said. He wasn't talking to the man anymore. He was talking to the whole room, and he was looking at Marlene the entire time. 3 years ago she walked into my shop and knocked a cup of pens off my desk and apologized like she'd broken my leg. And I hired her on the spot, and I have thanked God for it every single day since. This woman took a business that was drowning and set it right in a month. She knows every customer I've got by name. She remembers their kids. She calls the lonely ones back because she knows they've got nobody else to talk to. My whole shop runs on her, and half this town does too, and not one of you knows it because she never asks for a thing." His voice stayed level, but there was something underneath it now, something that made the hair stand up on your arms. "She makes my coffee every morning and leaves it on my bench and never says a word about it. When my temper gets away from me, she's the only soul alive who can pull me back. When I'm having a black day, and I have those, she just knows, and she brings me tea and sits with me and doesn't make me talk. She's covered a man's bill out of her own pocket so he wouldn't have to feel small in front of his boy. 3 years, and I have never once seen her be cruel to a living thing. Not even to people who deserved it. He glanced at the man when he said that, just for a second, then back to Marlene. And you, he said to the man low, you looked at the finest woman in this county and you saw a free meal. He shook his head slow. That tells me everything I ever need to know about you, and nothing about her. Marlene had both hands pressed to her mouth now, tears running down over her fingers. She was shaking her head, not in denial, just overwhelmed, like the words were too much to hold. Duke, she said through her hands. Duke, stop. You don't have to. But Duke wasn't done. And this was the part that cost him. This was the part he'd sworn he'd never say out loud. I do have to, he said. And his voice, for the first time, wavered, just a little. Because there's something I should have said a long time ago and I was a coward about it. I fixed your car and told you I had spare parts. I didn't. I bought every one of them, drove to 3 towns to find them. I keep your tea in the cabinet because I learned how you take it. That scarf you thought came from a customer, that was me. I noticed that dress the second you wore it to the party, and I've thought about it ever since. He swallowed hard. I've been in love with you, Marlene Ashby, for the better part of 3 years. And I never said it because I was scared you'd leave. And tonight I watched a man make you feel small, and I decided being scared wasn't worth 1 more minute of you not knowing what you're worth. You could have heard a pin drop in that diner. The waitress was openly crying. An old couple 2 booths down were holding hands. Somebody by the counter wiped their eyes with the back of a rough hand and pretended he hadn't. The man in the pressed shirt sat frozen, all the smug gone out of him. He looked like a boy who'd been caught, small and gray, and he had absolutely nothing to say. He just sat there with his mouth open while the whole room looked at him like he was something scraped off a boot. Marlene lowered her hands. Her face was a wreck of tears, but her eyes were wide and shining and looking at Duke like she was seeing him for the very first time. Like a door she'd never known was there had just swung open. You mean that? She whispered. Every word of it, you mean that. Every word, Duke said. I've never meant anything more. For a long moment nobody moved. The rain ticked against the glass. And then Marlene did something that made the waitress sob right out loud. She reached across that table, past the ruined dinner, past 3 years of silence, and she took Duke Calloway's big scarred hand in both of hers, and she held on like she was never going to let go. You big, stubborn fool, she said, laughing and crying at the same time. 3 years. 3 years, Duke, I know, he said. His voice was thick. I'm sorry it took me so long. The man in the pressed shirt finally found his legs. He stood up fast, knocking the table, mumbling something nobody could hear. He fumbled for his wallet and Duke stopped him with a look. No, Duke said, you don't get to pay. You don't get to do one decent thing tonight and tell yourself you're square. He nodded at the door. Get on out of that door and don't you ever come near her again. The man went. He didn't look back. The door swung shut behind him and the rain swallowed him up, and I promise you not a single person in that diner watched him go. Every eye was on the booth by the window, on the big man and the woman in the blue dress, holding hands across the table like the whole world had finally gotten something right. And that, I thought, was the end of it. A good end. Better than most, but it wasn't the end. Because Duke Calloway had one more thing to do that night. And it's the part I most want you to remember. Marlene wiped her face and laughed and said she didn't even want dessert. She just wanted to go home. Duke stood and helped her up like she was made of glass. And before they left, Duke reached into his jacket, took out his wallet and pressed a fold of bills into the crying waitress's hand. Way more than the meal cost. For your trouble, he told her. And because you had the guts to tell the truth when it counted. Don't ever lose that. She tried to give it back. He wouldn't let her. Then he bent down, right there in front of everyone, and picked up Marlene's fork off the floor. The one she dropped. The one nobody had moved to touch. He set it gently on the table like it mattered, like she mattered, and he held out his arm. Marlene took it. They walked out into the rain together, slow, in no hurry at all. And when Duke opened the truck door, Bandit came apart with joy, tail going, whole body wagging, licking Marlene's hands like he'd been waiting his whole dog life for her to finally show up. She laughed and let him. Duke helped her in out of the rain, and she scooted over, and the dog put his head in her lap. And for a second the three of them just sat there in the dark, the rain drumming the roof, nobody saying anything because nothing needed saying. That was the night everything changed. But you don't get a whole life from one night, so let me tell you where it went. They took it slow, the two of them. Duke was careful with her, careful the way a man is when he's finally holding the thing he was most afraid of wanting. She kept working at the shop, only now she'd catch him looking at her across the floor and she'd smile instead of blushing away from it. The coffee still landed on his bench every morning at 7. Only now he'd catch her hand when she set it down and hold it a second, and she'd let him. The men in his club found out fast, the way small towns always do. Every one of them liked her better than they liked Duke, and they told him so, and he agreed. Word got around Barstow about that night. The waitress told it, the old couple told it. It grew a little in the telling, the way good stories do, but the heart of it stayed true. And people looked at Duke a little different after that. Not softer exactly, but like they finally understood what all that quiet had been holding. Duke married Marlene the next spring. Small thing, out behind the shop, folding chairs and a borrowed arch and about 40 people who actually meant it. She wore blue. Of course she wore blue. Bandit walked her halfway down before he got distracted by a lizard, and everybody laughed, and Marlene laughed hardest of all. Duke stood up front in a real suit, looking like the suit was trying to kill him, and when she came down that aisle his eyes went wet, this mountain of a man, and he didn't bother to hide it. Not anymore. He was done hiding things, and here's the part I keep coming back to. Years later, somebody asked Duke at a barbecue why he did it that night. Why he stood up in front of a whole diner and laid his heart bare like that in front of strangers when he could have just walked her out to the truck and told her quiet in private where it was safe. Duke thought about it a while. He was good at long silences. Then he said, that man made her feel small in front of a room full of people. He said it plain. So she was going to feel big in front of that same room, or I wasn't going to be able to live with myself. Private wouldn't have fixed what he broke. She needed every one of them to hear it. She needed to walk out of there knowing exactly what she's worth, with witnesses. He looked over at Marlene then, across the yard, laughing with the waitress. Because they'd stayed friends, her and that girl, all those years. And Duke said, quiet mostly to himself, she spent her whole life being told she was too much. I just wanted her to hear one time out loud that she was never too much. She was exactly enough. She was more than I ever deserved. Nobody said anything for a while after that. Nothing needed saying. So that's the story. A big man in a wet leather vest who could have solved it with his fists and chose the harder thing instead. He didn't throw a punch. He didn't raise his voice. He pulled up a chair and told the truth, and the truth turned out to be stronger than any fist he owned. The cruel man got exactly what he came for, a story for the boys, just not the one he wanted. And Marlene Ashby, who walked into that diner hoping a stranger might see something worth loving in her, walked out on the arm of a man who'd seen it all along, for 3 long years, and had finally found the courage to say so. Sometimes the strongest thing a man can do isn't lift something heavy. It's set down the thing he's been afraid to say, and say it anyway, out loud in the light, where it counts. Duke Calloway figured that out on a rainy Friday night in a roadside diner, with a fork on the floor and a good dog waiting in the truck. And he never made her feel small again. Not for one single day of the rest of their lives.